The ether. A fertile plain of existence, in which a master cultivator navigates an ocean of stars. With him, his apprentice, a young mage who will soon discover all is not as it seems, as he unveils the tales of the verse.
The elevator ground to a halt. As the doors opened and the sound of distant cheering filled the small space, the time had come. The battle was set once again. He knew his directive. He must be victorious in combat while in the arena. No matter how many opponents or how formidable the odds, he cannot fail. SOTU 125, or Sodu, as they now called him, must continually upgrade or die. He was an intimidating machine, built to last the entirety of the war and withstand extreme conditions. Originally composed of parts that gave him a uniformed look, he had been forced through countless clashes to replace and upgrade, giving him the appearance of an adept combatant. At the center of his programming, he was still a special operations tactical unit. In spite of his rough exterior, Sodu was created to be an agile, tactical, and adaptive soldier, built for the purpose of killing. As the corridor gates opened, Sodu walked out onto the field of a former sports arena as the crowd's cheering intensified.
Upgrade or die. Upgrade or die. Upgrade or die.
They said with almost no emotion. The artificial announcer introduced the two combatants.
Returning to the arena, Sotu 125, representing the Nacon faction, versus combatant Loco 076, representing the Aurelion faction.
Sodu scanned his opponent, analyzing, searching for weaknesses. Locum was an odd opponent in the arena. Until recently, Sodu had faced many military units who were created for combat, unlike his current opponent, which had been apparently dragged from industrial use. It was a bulky, 5-meter-high machine designed for originally heavy construction. Where most of Sodu's opponents carried a head, Locum's large torso had only broad shoulders and a slight rise where a neck should be. This rise is where his scanners were mounted. To further the argument that this machine was capable of combat, Locum was also heavily plated and armed with an industrial drill for drilling solid rock on the left, while on the right was a 3-pronged claw used for lifting heavy steel beams. All of this heavy machinery sat upon a set of tracks, like those on a bulldozer. To the crowd, this gave the illusion that Locum would be the clear victor. Yet Sodu had retrieved from his archives one piece of info that gave him the advantage. Locum 076 models were not built for speed, and their control panels were made for easy access and maintenance. This meant, if Sodu could reach his backside, he could easily disable it.
Combatants at the ready.
The robotic crowd grew silent.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Exactly at the end of the final countdown, as the crowd roared in mechanical chanting, Sodu sprung forward in an instant towards Locum. In a narrow sprint, he closed the approximately 100-meter gap in only 8.5 seconds. Locum spooled his drill in preparation to meet his oncoming opponent. Anticipating his opponent's skill with his primary weapon, Sodu calculated the exact moment he would need to go from sprinting to sliding on the ground. In a fraction of a second, Sodu narrowly slid past the drill as it followed his motion. Barely grazing his helm. As soon as he was clear of the drill, Sodu engaged his propulsion boosters, located on the back of his shoulders. This immediately propelled him onto the front of Locum's torso. Sodu, having already calculated the most danger would be the claw arm, which would be impossible to escape if it ever locked onto him. He knew of a small opening at the right elbow, which slightly exposed the hydraulic lines. As Locum spun his tracks in an attempt to face his opponent, Sodu torched the hydraulic line. Catching fire, Locum engaged his fire suppression system, the steam from which blinded Locum's visuals completely. Sodu had already begun to climb up the access ladder on the back of Locum. By the time the flames were extinguished, Sodu had reached the panel. Locking himself into position, he began pounding the fortified plate which protected Locum's mainframe. Though Locum attempted to handle every disruption thrown at it, it would be too late. Detaching an electrical baton from his side, Sodu short-circuited Locum and ended the fight. The entire battle had lasted only 20 seconds. The next fight was more formidable, but highly predictable. MORU S-15 was a police unit which had been repurposed for the arena. His mistake was his protocol to rely on his riot shield. Provoking his directive to restrain a target by pushing with his shield, Sodu incited Moru to push with all force, which allowed him to simply step aside and quickly insert his baton into Moru's helmet at the base of the neck, short-circuiting the unit's motherboard. One by one, his opponents fell. Talo X-30, a drone unit capable of flight and armed with a pneumatic nail gun, did not anticipate Sodu's ability to maneuver up the wall and drag the drone from the air. Tusu 124 was one of the few tactical units still capable of combat. However, unlike Sodu, Tusu was built for agility, but lacked the upgrades to his armament to withstand Sodu's attacks. Zelu-87, primarily used for deep-sea operations and built to withstand extreme pressures, proved a worthy adversary. Yet, despite his heavy defenses and useful armaments, Zelu was not built to withstand extreme heats, eventually having his visor fry against Sodu's torch, which rendered him blind for the final blow.
I perceive that our programming is evolving.
Aurelion, the most human-like of the faction leaders, remarked to the other two. The three of them watched from an observation booth at the top of the arena. They meticulously kept track of each battle, making victories and losses on a holographic scoreboard.
I perceive,
Aurelion continued,
that the chanting of our directive is increasing. I have gauged that many programs in the stance have adopted a culture similar to that of our former programmers.
As Aurelion explained his concepts, he moved more fluid and human-like than the other two. Solon disagreed on this matter, however, and quickly interjected before Aurelion could continue.
I calculate that the behavior is predictable, given the absence of our original programmers. This is simply a shared glitch, and nothing that can't be addressed by the winning faction.
The directive is clear.
Nacon announced, being the most direct leader among them.
Our focus should be on determining the winning faction. We will address this hypothesized glitch another time.
Nacon turned their attention to the scoreboard. The scores had been mostly different. Aurelion had been losing since the beginning, only claiming 25 victories to his faction. His program combatants were never as sophisticated as the others, usually carrying more primitive weaponry and less tactical programming. Meanwhile, the other two were neck and neck in the highest scores. Nacon had been in the lead for several victories. Being the leading military faction, he almost always carried a tactical advantage. Yet Solon was not far behind him. He was, after all, the most calculating of the three. His advantage was his constant study of his two opponents, consistently upgrading each machine he threw into the arena. The scores were 87 to Nacon, and 85 to Solon. One definitive victory could be the deciding factor.
SOTU 125 has won over 12 victories in the past 3 weeks. The directive would show this program will be victorious in the next encounter, which will ensure our faction's victory.
As Nacon said this, a hint of pride seemed to affect his words. Aurelion, noticing this, added,
agreed, and I perceive that most programs have begun calling him Sutu. His support among the crowds has even crossed faction lines, garnering a following across all of the factions.
Nacon paused. Turning to address Aurelion, he replied,
which will only ease assimilation once our faction is in control.
Nacon stared menacingly towards Aurelion. He towered before Aurelion, shadowing over him with a broad build, dark imposing colors, and an armored structure that made him feel almost more monstrous than machine.
Miscalculation,
Solon announced. Rolling forward on his wheeled tracks, Solon analyzed the hologram and its previous battles. Adding on, Solon continued,
From my calculations, there is a singular error to your directive.
Nacon turned to address Solon and approached.
The directive is clear. I have calculated the probability of your success and have...
Solon immediately cut him off.
From my calculations, your directive lacks the correct information. Program ARLOK-013 has won over 25 victories for our faction. Ever since munitions depleted, your combatants have lacked the proper weaponry to be effective against ARLOK-013. He simply cannot be defeated in hand-to-hand combat. It is a miscalculation for you to assume your victory is ensured.
The two machines stared intently at one another, barely noticing that their posture had become combative. Undeterred from his process of thinking, Aurelion finally spoke up.
I perceive even victory will become irrelevant. If our programs rewrite themselves as they've continued to do, factions will become obsolete. We have already shifted our programmed warfare from battlefields to arena combat. Our structure, directive, even our programming will change, and nothing will be the same.
Turning his head slightly to Aurelion, Nacon replied,
I am already too close to achieving my directive to be deterred now.
As he turned away from the other two programs, he added, with a tinge of regret,
Regardless, what would we do beyond this war? There is nothing more than our programming.
The three sat in silence, calculating the various outcomes that could occur. It was then that the artificial announcer broke the silence.
Next combatants preparing for combat.
The directive is clear. We prepare for the next match.
Solon, responding slightly ceremoniously, replied,
Let us prepare our combatants.
With a tone of defeat, Aurelion closed the discussion with these final words.
So be it. Let them upgrade or die.
Upon finishing the debate with the other faction leaders, Nacon made his way to the repair station where Sodu was being prepped for the next fight. The maintenance bots were doing a crude job of replacing a shin guard that had been torn off his right leg, replacing the old one with scraps from an old military vehicle. Nacon approached Sodu, causing him to stand up straight at attention.
Please,
Nacon ordered.
status report.
He then demanded. Sodu did a quick scan of his systems, quickly responding.
Systems are as optimal as can be expected.
Nacon processed his response for a moment, and then replied,
The directive is clear. Your combatant is superior in this fight. You will not have the capabilities to win without an upgrade.
I have upgraded with all the capabilities as resources will allow.
Not all.
Nacon declared. Flashing his visor, a small maintenance bot reciprocated the response, flying away to retrieve something from a nearby tool locker. Nacon continued.
Our salvaging crew recovered a part of an old Devastator unit.
The maintenance bot brought forward to Sodu a small part no bigger than a handgun. It was round and ornate, with a long nozzle suggesting the capability to fire something powerful.
the unit was no longer operating. However, this small plasma cannon was still intact. We believed the last one was used a decade ago, and we have found that the information is no longer correct. It only holds a single charge. Once fired, it will no longer be operational. You must fire the target when they are at their most vulnerable to ensure an optimal outcome.
As Nacon explained more on the cannon's capabilities, the maintenance bot began to install the cannon into a hidden compartment inside Sodu's left shoulder.
We must ensure success for our faction. The directive is clear. We must win this war at last. Do you comply?
Sodu did not respond immediately. This lag to respond was unusual for a military bot, especially in front of a superior.
Do you comply?
Nacon said more forcefully.
Permission to speak, General.
Nacon, surprised, not having heard the request since he had overseen a human division, granted the request, uncertain of the outcome.
You may.
This is our primary directive. After victory, I cannot compute the difference in outcome, whether we succeed or fail.
Upon saying this, Nacon approached with an insidious posture. Glaring directly towards Sodu, Nacon spoke with an authoritative tone.
You will use this upgrade, or you will die.
Sodu, taken aback by this response, felt a strange flicker in his memory banks, and even his circuits. Though he had heard the directive of his programming, upgrade or die, before, he could not recall ever observing a mechanical superior using it as a directive till now.
Do you comply?
Nacon said with more demand. Processing the moment, Sodu finally replied,
I do comply.
A vast sea of various machines had gathered to this large assembly. The chanting of their programming, upgrade or die, began to fill the air. Many of those in the stands were basic units, fitted for manual labor and domestic use. Surveillance drones flew above the stadium, worker bots brightly flashed their visors, assistant care units raised their arms to the air in a victorious gesture, and all of the rest stomped the ground in unison. Though they appeared to do all of this mechanically, something within each of their collective programming incited them to mimic their original programmers. Among them, one did watch eagerly as the arena began to open its gates. Not so different from the more human-like bots around him, he wore a hooded cloak and stood with an odd posture. He had more personality than the other units. In spite of these differences, hardly any of the machines around him took notice. But it wouldn't matter if they did. To all of them, he was invisible in plain sight. For he was not there to enjoy the spectacle. Rather, he was there to make it happen. When victory would be inevitable, Horace Penn would make his move.
Returning to the arena, Soju 125, representing the Nacon faction.
Sodu stepped out from the gates again for the last time.
versus combatant Arlock 013, representing the Solon faction.
As the opposing gates opened, Sodu looked upon his opponent. This Arlock unit was a little worse for wear, given his experience in the arena. However, the only piece that looked replaced was the plating on his upper torso. This looked vaguely familiar to Sodu, but it had been crudely painted to match the rest of his appearance, appearing as though it was the only upgrade they had remaining. Regardless, it was in good condition. The Arlock units were something unique. They were one of the last robot production lines, designed for human service and protection. This was most particularly true at the end of the war. They were designed to look more human, coated in white, and more ergonomic than any other previous series, even built with a facial visor constructed of a composite alloy, which was virtually indestructible. Sodu's scan brought up the analysis.
Target ARLOK 013. Data name Arlock. Artificial Representative Logistics Operations Kernel. Speed high. Durability medium. Defenses advanced processor, acrobatic build, agility. Weapons scanning. System scanned. Identified. Saw blades, cryo gas, jet propulsion. Probability of success 45%. Advantage Devastator plasma cannon.
After Sodu was briefed by his scan, he had fully comprehended his disadvantage. His greatest and only asset was the newly obtained plasma cannon. If Nacon had not given him this weapon, his odds would have been 3-1. And if he misses his shot with the weapon, then his odds will be 0.
Combatants at the ready.
The robotic crowd grew silent.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The instant that the horns blew, Arlock was already in motion.
Engage.
Sodu's combat system alerted. In the first few seconds, Arlock had fired 2 saw blades. Sodu reacted by avoiding one and catching the second. The crowd surprisingly clamored with great noise at this sign of amazing speed. But as Sodu threw the saw blade back, Arlock with relative ease recaptured the projectile and threw it, lodging it into Sodu's right shoulder.
Warning, major damage detected.
The two then collided. Back and forth, they each delivered powerful blows. Every second filled with a blur of strikes and counter-strikes. Sodu's attacks were strong and firm, but many of them were dissipated by Arlock's swifter reactions.
Damage report. Severe. Probability of success 32%.
The chance of success was already beginning to fall. The next strike Sodu could not defend. In a burst of speed, Arlock dismantled the torch in Sodu's right forearm.
Warning, flamethrower compromised. Probability of success 23%.
In an attempt to counter Arlock's agility, Sodu retrieved his baton from its hidden compartment. But as it extended, Arlock, in a blinding kick, knocked it from Sodu's hand. Again, the combat system alerted.
Warning. Probability of success 15%. Recommend disengage.
Sodu was close to failure. At this moment, he had no other choice but to retreat. And yet, his directive was to use the plasma cannon. But if he did now, his odds of success were low. A continued barrage of strikes relentlessly overwhelmed Sotu.
Warning. Probability of success 10%. Destruction imminent. Evasive maneuvers auto-engaging.
Overriding the command, Sodu continued to process his options. His directive was to win. He was programmed to survive. His directive was at odds with his own calculations. And yet again, his programming persisted.
System at imminent danger. Engaging evasive maneuvers.
Once again, Soda rejected the command and continued to fend off Arlok's blows to the best of his abilities.
Warning. Probability at 5%. System power 35%. Disengage recommended.
Time was running out. If Soto did not follow his programming, he would be destroyed. And if he did lose the battle, he would forfeit victory. With every nanosecond that ticked by, Soto's processing intensified and reached critical levels, being almost more than his processor could handle, while searching for a solution. It was close. It was near to the end. It was...
Welcome. New system protocol discovered. Program upgrade acceptable. Initiating defensive strategy.
Seemingly from out of nowhere, a new algorithm was created. As he completed these computations, this unknown and unfamiliar conclusion occurred to him in his circuits.
My directive is clear. I must lose to survive.
Sodu, seeing no other option, and being incredibly risky, initiated his defensive posture. Using the anchors in his feet, he quickly drilled himself in place. Raising his fists in defense, and locked himself to the ground.
Probability of success 10 to 50%. Engaging system shutdown in T-7 seconds.
Holding himself in place, he allowed Arlok to make his attack. Analyzing his movements, Sodu calculated for the perfect strike. Now having a new directive to guide him through. Since Sodu could no longer be moved, Arlok would be enticed to make heavier strikes.
Anchors disengaged.
At the moment Arlok dealt a final blow, the countdown finished.
2, 1.
With the last hit, Soda was launched into the air, landing a short distance away. The crowd fell silent. All awaited for Arlok's final blow. Approaching Sodu's seemingly lifeless form, Arlok aimed for his head with the last saw blade. For him, Sotu was completely defenseless.
Upgrade or die.
Arlok announced to the crowd, sending them into a riotous cheer. Standing over Sotu, he extended his saw blade from his arm. But unbeknownst to him, Sotu silently came back online.
System online. Evasive countermeasure. Plasma cannon activated.
Usually, Arlok would be prepared for every move Sodu could make. Yet the one thing that Arlok could not anticipate was a spark of creativity. Before his victory could be guaranteed, Sodu, in a quick motion, fired his plasma cannon into a vulnerable opening. The flash of energy had lit up the stadium with a bright neon red. The whole crowd was silently in awe. A weapon of this caliber had not been used for a considerable time.
Target immobilized. Well done, Sotu.
Sodu stood triumphantly before the crowd. Upon doing so, the arena roared with an unfamiliar excitement. Chanting, "Upgrade or die," Sodu approached the remains of Arlok. Picking up his baton as he reached him, he stood over Arlok, analyzing his form.
Enemy unit unable to engage.
His new program announced. This was it. All he had to do now was finish the fight. Horus, watching from the stands, realized his moment had come, casting a simple spell, the light of which shines steadily down towards Sotu. Sotu lifted his baton, ready to strike, but before he could, the reflection of light from the spell caught his attention. Horus's spell shined upon the now scorched armor on Arlok's chest. Until now, the paint had obscured a small detail to the upgrade Arlok had received. The unit code number Sotu recognized. SOTU 125. The Sotu 125 battalion number. Arlok's upgrade came from Sotu's battalion. And if this was the latest in upgrades, then this meant they were scavenging from his own faction. A strange thing began to happen. Sotu's memory banks began to fire sparks of energy, showing flashes of the old war. Many machines from Sotu's battalion had been destroyed, designed to protect humanity with the utmost defense. Every day it seemed as though humans slowly became less and less common by each day, until one day there were no more. A circuit fired another memory into place. An old factory filled with the new line of SOTU 125s, the latest battalion to be launched into the war.
You really think these buckets of bolts will survive the war?
The sergeant asked the general.
Certainly. They were built to last. And if it isn't clear already, the NACOM program will see that it's done.
Well, I hope they're better than the last battalion.
And as the sergeant said this, the general leaned toward Sotu's visor and said in a hauntingly familiar response,
They have to. Their directive is clear. They'll use these upgrades, or they will die.
The general said. The phrase echoed through Sotu's processor.
They will use these upgrades, or they will die.
Sotu continued to replay and analyze the file.
You will use these upgrades, or you will die. Use these upgrades, or you will die. Upgrade, or you will die.
Upgrade or die. Upgrade or die. Upgrade or die.
Sodu realized the awful truth. The war that the machines had continued and adjusted to fight was doomed to lead to the same end as their former programmers. With this new concept, Sodu froze in place, his baton only a few centimeters from frying Arlok's circuits, and the crowd suddenly became still at this action. Standing erect, Sodu dropped his baton, faced the crowd, and in an almost surprised declaration said,
Upgrade and live.
Sodu reached out and picked up Arlok's broken body from the ground, and simultaneously raised his fist to the air, all the while holding Arlok in a safe grip. At this display, the crowd bursted out in response.
Upgrade and live! 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 Upgrade and live!
Horus soon found himself back in the garden, as the overwhelming light faded from his view. He was still not completely used to the transitions that returned him back to the tower and his master, but it was not the most pressing thought on his mind at the moment.
You look concerned, young man.
The master said with a greeting. Horus appeared pensive as he searched for the right words. I witnessed the spell you told me to cast, and upon doing so, I saw that the machine appeared to change his mind.
Yes,
The master said with encouragement.
wasn't that something?
Horus, confused, yet wanting to better understand, added, But they're just machines. Constructs of metal and electricity. Why are they so important? The master stepped closer to Horus, forcing Horus to attentively look at him.
Sotu and his kind were unwittingly made by their creators with a power they hardly understood. There was more to them than even they themselves realized.
For a moment, the master said nothing. Then, in an earnest and sincere tone, he said,
And besides, it mattered to Sotu. So it matters to me.
Taken aback by this statement, Horus found it profoundly curious that the master cared so deeply for individuals that Horus only saw as machines.
If you found this task intriguing,
The master continued,
then you'll be greatly surprised by this next one.